Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. And of course, this is Thanksgiving week, so I hope you are maybe enjoying a little bit of a break. Some are having that break. Some are looking forward to that break. Hope you had a great weekend, and we're going to be focusing a lot of different topics and really trying to bring a lot of information, commentary, and the rest in this first hour. Next hour, we'll have Philip Yancey with us. This is the book he says maybe was the one he was always destined to write, Where the Light Fell. Tomorrow, we have Mark Yarborough, who is with us. And he will be with us talking about some of the things he's written about, to William Mounts, about how you can trust the Bible. Wednesday, we have Jerry Newcomb with us as we get closer to Thanksgiving, talk about the pilgrims and Thanksgiving and some of that. And so, of course, as I mentioned last Friday, our Thursday and Friday programs will be taped, but they're sort of the best of, and I think you really enjoy all the conversation there as well. Let's, if we can, start by looking back to Friday and talking about, if you will, some of the fallout from two events. One was the decision in the House of Representatives to actually vote for this financial boondoggle, and that's a kind phrase for it, because as we go through some of the details, you are going to begin to realize why we encouraged you to contact your member of Congress about this. And basically, it went down a party line vote. I'll give you the details on that in just a minute. It will now go to the Senate, so we'll give you an opportunity to contact your two senators about it as well. And that's the first thing came out of Friday. But of course, you also have the not guilty plea and then verdict that came from the particular court case that we've talked about here before. And that is something of some concern, because Kyle Rittenhouse, got the name wrong. We just have not said the name very much because we felt that there were other topics to address. But I will mention it today because it raises some other questions about the way media has covered it. I suspect some people probably watched the interview he's doing tonight with Tucker Carlson, and we'll come to all sorts of additional conclusions, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Let's, if we can, though, focus on what I think is going to affect your life much more. My question oftentimes when I come to this microphone is, what's going to affect you, your faith, your family, your freedom? And as much as some of these court cases have been important, and certainly we want to have a very good and working criminal justice system, we also find ourselves really wanting to, as much as possible, try to focus on those things that are going to affect you and your family. And as much as the acquittal certainly dominated the news over the weekend, the editors in our first article here, which is entitled The Kamikaze Democrats, said that the more significant story, and I would agree, in the long run, was the House passage Friday of the multi-trillion-dollar tax climate entitlement spending bill. Those are their words. And they said that Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, marched the majority off the cliff back in 2010 with a vote on Obamacare, and they said now she has done it again. She was able to get the vote 220 to 213. No Republicans voted for the bill. You had one lone Democratic dissenter. That would be Representative Jared Golden of Maine. But otherwise, you have a number of individuals in the Democratic Party who identify themselves sometimes as moderates or certainly not as strongly leaning left as some of the leadership in the House of Representatives, now having to go back to their districts and run on a record that I don't think is going to be very popular for them. This is exactly why the editors of the Wall Street Journal referred to these individuals as the kamikaze Democrats. And the matter of fact, the editors point out that Nancy Pelosi's 81 years of age, most certainly retiring after this Congress. The vote is a legacy for her, but as they say, the members of Congress are going to have to explain quite a bit. Given the fact that some of you may want to contact your senators, let me give you a few more details. We've mentioned them from time to time, but I think this article, and it is on our website, pointofview.net, in case you'd like to read it in its entirety, reminds you of why there have been so many people that are absolutely concerned, almost terrified, of what would happen if indeed this was passed. Let's take the issue, for example, of immigration. It would give 6.5 million so-called illegal migrants in this country who've been here since 2011 a 10-year right to work in the United States. This may be stripped from the Senate bill, but at least the House members are on record of wanting to legalize millions of migrants, even as the border, they say, has become a lawless mess. Let's take another one in terms of energy. There's an $8 billion fee, methane fee of all things, which effectively is a tax on natural gas production and would certainly affect consumer energy prices. At a time when you're paying more for gasoline at the pump, when you're paying more for heating your house, whether it's heating oil, whether it's natural gas or coal, whatever it might be, some have estimated that this would raise the average family's price for natural gas, if that's what you receive, by 17%. Now, you might remember that the president had pledged that nobody that made less than $400,000 a year would see their taxes go up. Well, that's one of those things which is true but terribly misleading. If you don't see that fee as a tax, then you can say, no, it's just the price of energy is going to go up. Yeah, but 17%. And by the way, I almost always assume that these estimates are low because once you get into the reality of all it probably is even higher. Let's take another one. You might say, well, at least they didn't give tax cuts to the rich. Oh, yes, they did, because you have a situation in which we talked about the SALT taxes. We talked about those over Friday, and certainly over the weekend. Many pointed out that if you are in what is called a high tax state, those usually tend to be blue states, then they raise the state and local tax deduction up from from $10,000 to $80,000. And so as a result, that would benefit, in some cases, if you're a Democrat running in a Democrat state or a Democrat congressional district. But overall, again, it ends up being essentially a tax cut for the most wealthy individuals who find themselves paying a very significant amount of income tax. Some others that you might see in upcoming ads, $2.5 billion, which is essentially a handout to trial lawyers because it allows them to deduct their expenses on contingency fee lawsuits. There's $1.7 billion, which ends up being a subsidy for local journalists. I know that will show up in an ad pointing out that here, what this particular House and maybe Senate and Joe Biden did was actually bribe some of the journalists so that they get more favorable news coverage. And you can see that immediately we're talking about all sorts of problems with this piece of legislation. Some might get dropped in the Senate, but the best thing that could happen is for there never to be a vote on the Senate, or for Joe Manchin and a few others stand their ground and say, nope, we're not going to vote for it. And that is the end of that particular disaster. Let's take a break, though, because there are really good questions being raised, and many of them raised over the weekend, of the fact that this would increase taxes dramatically and wouldn't even come close to paying for all the things that the Biden administration wants to spend money on. So we need to take a break. We'll tell you a little bit more about what's in the piece of legislation. After all, we're told you have to pass it to see what's in it. What's in it isn't very good.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Harvard professor Steven Pinker has a simple explanation for why Republicans wanted to reopen the economy. Evangelicals were exerting an influence because they believe in an afterlife, which he said is a malignant delusion. It was a bizarre tweet, even for an atheist. Although many have answered his comment, I thought we might revisit it because you are likely to run into similar arguments. Pinker argued that belief in an afterlife devalues actual lives and discourages action that would make them longer, safer, and happier. Actually, just the opposite is the case. Evangelical Christians believe that we are created in the image of God. He has endowed us with purpose, meaning, and dignity. Christians have historically been a source for good. They believe that what we do in society has eternal consequences. By contrast, an atheistic view devalues life. If we're merely an evolutionary byproduct, where is human dignity? If we're the accidental result of mass plus energy plus chance plus time, where is there any meaning to life? Moreover, why should we even care what another person might think, since our brain is just a meat computer with millions of neurons firing? There is no truth. There is no purpose. The Bible makes moral demands on us. Western civilization is based upon the Ten Commandments and other moral precepts. Civilized people obey these moral laws in order to have a better society. Atheism makes no demands on anyone because it rejects the idea of God and moral laws. I would argue that the denial of an afterlife is a malignant delusion. If there is no final justice, then wrongs will never be accurately judged. There is no God. There is no justice. There is no fairness. This is the sad, dark world of the atheist. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to spend a little more time talking about that piece of legislation that passed the House. Then we'll talk briefly about some of the reaction to the acquittal of Kyle Rittenhouse. And if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Lots of people have weighed in with some of their concerns about the piece of legislation, which now goes to the Senate. One of those individuals is our good friend Gary Bauer, in which he says, look, there are just plenty of problems with this bill, and actually talked about the fact, as I mentioned on Friday just briefly, that the future, I suspect, House Speaker of the House, and right now is the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, actually engaged in an 8.5-hour filibuster, kind of Mr. Smith goes to Washington kind of filibuster, a real filibuster, not some of the fake ones that you have in the Senate. But nevertheless, the first thing that certainly Gary Bauer explains is that this is the biggest tax and spending bill in American history. Now, you have to ask yourself the question, how well are you being served by the media? Has anyone really told you that this is the largest tax bill we've ever had? I brought that up on Friday, and immediately I looked down and saw somebody called in because they wanted to challenge that, and what I thought would be appropriate would be to point you back to an article we posted on Wednesday. You can simply go to pointofview.net. You can see this article, which is very well done, by the way, in which it points out that when you look at the current tax rate that we have right now, we as a country are kind of in the middle of the pack. We have tax rates that are comparable to countries like Sweden, Turkey, Spain, the United Kingdom, for example. But if this plan that is now being considered by the Senate were implemented, the tax rate would climb significantly and we would leap over every other country in the developed world. It's a classic example of we're number one. Sometimes when you say we're number one, you don't want to be number one on certain topics, and that is one of those. So we can look at this put in together by the Tax Foundation. And I've seen other kinds of statements and estimates being made that are comparable to that we would have the highest tax rates in the world. Now, that is hard for anybody to believe, given the fact that we had this promise that no one who makes less than $400,000 a year would be affected. But you can obviously see that some of those tax issues, especially when you revoke some of the tax cuts before, would put us in that category. But there may be some of you listening right now that say, well, obviously we've got to raise taxes. We're going to spend all this money. And I hate to bring the really bad news to you, but this will not even come close to paying for the spending that is listed in this legislation for a couple of reasons. Number one, there is the obvious. Well, it's not so obvious for some legislators, but it's the obvious for most of us that have some level of common sense, obvious economic fact that when you raise taxes, you don't always raise tax revenue. If I raise taxes on your business, you may start rethinking about whether or not you want to continue to do that business. If I raise taxes on some of your investments, you may say, I'm just going to cash them out because it's not going to be helpful to me. And so oftentimes raising taxes doesn't bring in money. It tends to discourage all sorts of activities. But even if you don't accept that argument, I think the one that I could make for even some of these hard-headed people that believe everything that comes from the Congressional Budget Office would have to recognize that the argument is that this is supposedly a $2 trillion bill. And yet I was able just even on Friday, and you can find some of this in an upcoming commentary that I have, finding people from different, if you will, political spectrum that all agree with one thing. It's almost twice as much, in some cases more than twice as much. Why is that? Well, there's all sorts of tricks and gimmicks that are used. As a matter of fact, the article that I just posted a minute ago talked about that. If you go to the second page, it says something like, really, the argument that it's going to spend $2 trillion over 10 years, that's not true because they use gimmicks such as phasing out programs that have no intention of phasing out. I've said this before. If indeed you say, well, this will only be implemented for 2 years, does anybody seriously believe that once you provide a benefit or an entitlement, that it's going to be phased out in 2 years? I don't believe that world. You don't believe in that world, but nevertheless, people do. So if you use the numbers, and again, if you got something to write with, you can say, first of all, number one, the United States would be number one in taxes, but point number two, what would it really cost? Not $2 trillion, the Penn-Wharton budget model, which tends to be kind of a little more left and center, I would say. I know people there at UPenn and Wharton that would probably be a little more left of center in terms of their estimates, still estimate that the actual cost of this legislation before the Senate is $4.6 trillion. Well, unless you don't know math very well, there's a striking difference between $2 trillion and $4.6 trillion. But let me give you another one. This one comes from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. They might be a little more on the right of center, and they estimate that it would be $4.9 trillion. The point I'm making is that what you have is the largest taxation and spending bill in American history. That's what Gary Bauer says, and now I've given you some documentation. Gary Bauer also goes on to say it puts the IRS on steroids, so he says it can squeeze more money out of taxpayers with intrusive audits. Because after all, the argument is we've got to certainly figure out ways to squeeze the golden goose enough to not kill the golden goose, but we need a lot of golden eggs in order to pay for this thing. Then, of course, you have the Congressional Budget Office he talks about that says that even when you assume these budget gimmicks,
that are put forth in the bill, because the Congressional Budget Office, to their credit, only can deal with what's in the legislation. They can't roll their eyes and say, wait a minute, you're saying this is going to be phased out in 2 years. We know it's going to exist in perpetuity. But even using their numbers, okay, which I think are somewhat phony because of the way the bill's written, the Congressional Budget Office, if you want to put this as point number 3, would add an additional $370 billion, $370 billion with a B, dollars to the deficit. And I do believe, as Gary Bauer points out, that is a gross underestimate, because it does not assume that some of these things that are written into the bill would become permanent. And then you have, of course, some of the other points he concludes once again that this would be a $4 to $5 trillion budget. And then he says one more. He does raise the question about this idea of this being, according to the Hill, which again is the organ that reports what is happening with congressional legislation. So it's really tied into kind of the establishment media. But even the Hill, which reports on congressional action, said it is the most extensive immigration reform package reviewed by Congress in 35 years. And of course, we just mentioned a minute ago, 6.5 million illegal migrants, aliens, whatever phrase you want to use, would be allowed to stay in the country. And some people estimate that that would be an additional $111 billion. So the point he's making is that we certainly have to encourage at least those of you that maybe live in West Virginia and have a senator by the name of Joe Manchin, those of you perhaps that live in Arizona, have a senator by the name of Kyrsten Sinema, or perhaps in some of the other states where you are hearing this broadcast, have some others that maybe haven't come forward to express their concerns. This might be the time for them to do so, because we see a piece of legislation that deserves your attention, and we wanted to try to give you as many facts as we possibly can. Back to the other point, I noticed that Newt Gingrich was saying all of this is going to mean that you are going to have a tsunami that probably will drown the Democrats. And he uses lots of good illustrations. For example, you have Glenn Youngkin, who was able to win the governorship in Virginia, along with Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears. You have some very interesting groups of individuals that have won in other kinds of states, including, and you got to smile, this one individual, an independent truck driver, Ed Durr, defeated the New Jersey State Senate President Stephen Sweeney in one of the biggest upsets in modern politics. Durr spent all of $2,300, and nevertheless, you saw that. In case those you think are one-offs, we have an example of a Republican won in the city attorney's race in Seattle, which has oftentimes been a very liberal bastion, and a Republican recently won in a special election in San Antonio with 73% Latinos. And he gives many examples that illustrate again that if indeed the election were held today or even in the next couple of months, it would be a tsunami that would drown the Democrats. And part of that is because Nancy Pelosi decided to force all the Democrats to walk the plank, and some of them are going to get into the water very quickly. Anyway, that's just a little bit of a look at something that happened on Friday. There are lots of people talking about it. That's why we thought we would talk about it. We'll come back and talk about that acquittal and then move on to some other important issues. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. During this Thanksgiving week, I suspect most of the time you're probably traveling or getting ready and you're probably just listening. But if you'd like to join us, feel free to give us a call. If not, just sit back and we're going to try to focus on a couple of other issues. One of those relates to the booklet I'm holding up right now for those of you watching online, and it's the booklet on the issue of criminal justice. And we wrote this a while back. Probably need to update it because there have been some very positive things happening in criminal justice reform. But whenever we talk about a trial, and we don't talk about too many of those because unless that trial affects broader issues like religious liberty or some kind of rights that you may have or not have, I don't want to spend a lot of time on those. But this is a case of where after the fact, as Rich Lowry says today in his particular commentary, that if the acquittal of Kyle Rittenhouse was an affirmation of our system of justice, the reaction to the not guilty verdicts in his case, because there were 5, exposes an ongoing foundational threat to the rule of law. Now, first of all, there are some people that said, well, he got off because he was white on the whole issue of self-defense. And, of course, there have been a number of people that have posted Facebook pictures of an African American that just got off on a issue of self-defense. And let me say the obvious things. I think we all know that. Was he guilty of murder? No. Was he guilty of making a bad decision? Yeah, I think almost everybody agrees with that. I noticed David French said, look, while we can certainly say that he actually had a valid case for self-defense, we can also say he was not a hero and not an individual that needed to be put on some kind of platform. Okay, so we got that. But the point that what Rich Lowry is pointing out is that you had just an unbelievable number of reactions, very harsh reactions, and I'm not going to go through those. You've seen them, and if you go out on Facebook, you'll see them, and if you have any kind of internet feed, you know what I'm talking about, in which you've had people in the media and all sorts of other activists saying that this is a travesty of justice and all sorts of things, which oftentimes are bolstered by very inaccurate statements. And I've seen so many of those. Britt Hume actually documented a couple that I thought were interesting, where he said, look at this thread. And you look down and go, okay, this is wrong, that is wrong. Matter of fact, except for the fact they got the fact that he's 17 years of age, almost everything else they said was wrong. But it's just the sheer anger and venom that came that began to suggest maybe, if nothing else, I need to pass on to our younger generation that it wasn't always this way. Now, I'm not saying that we didn't have a Rodney King trial and riots and, even some reaction to the O.J. Simpson trial, but the reality is you are having, in some cases, individuals that are news anchors, primarily in cable news, who are making statements. And now for those of you that are older, I'm talking to you that have no hair or gray hair, you can't imagine that David Brinkley or Chet Huntley or just all sorts of individuals in the news, Walter Cronkite. You can't imagine even Ted Koppel. I mean, you just go down this list. You can't even imagine that some of them would make those kinds of statements. And so I think it is maybe just helpful for just a minute to tell the younger generation that what we're seeing right now, primarily more in the cable news networks, is something that is really very unprecedented. I guess I could hold up another booklet, and that's the one on media bias, because everything is become politicized. And here is Rich Lowry says, why should the president of the NAACP, for instance, be exercised about the confrontation between Kyle Rittenhouse and Joseph Rosenbaum, a white 36-year-old mentally ill man who had spent significant time in prison? Neither is a cop, neither is black, neither is an instrument of state, neither is a victim of racial discrimination, and yet that began to be part of the issue. And of course, you've seen some of the parades, the protests, the comments as well. And I just thought it would be worth mentioning that if we don't get to a point where we assume some basics about the criminal justice system, not the least of which innocent until proven guilty, we're starting to see more and more in which the media decides to label individuals without any facts whatsoever, actually come to very strong conclusions before all the facts have been presented in a court of law, in which you have a chance to challenge some of those facts, and in which individuals oftentimes then face any kind of repercussions if indeed they don't render the verdict that you want. And all the evidence that we've seen recently of wanting to dox various members of the jury. If you're not familiar with dox, it's to post their name, address, phone number, cause them all sorts of grief. You had that one individual that later identified himself, so I guess it's true, producer for MSNBC, ran a red light, caused all sorts of difficulty because he was obviously taking pictures of the bus as the jurors were there. This does not look good for a criminal justice system that has had its flaws in the past, not ignoring that, but a criminal justice system that is in many cases been the wonder of the watching world, in which we are willing to give so many rights and benefits to a person who is accused. And again, the assumption and the presumption of innocence unless proven guilty, of the preponderance of facts necessary to convict an individual. Yes, there have been some mistakes, and of course we talk about some of this in the biblical view of criminal justice and how we can fix some of those ideas, but I think it's an illustration again of some real concerns. Anyway, I want to move on in just a minute, but Rich Lowry ends his very good piece by saying this: what woke progressives ultimately want is a justice system that looks more like a campus sexual assault tribunals. Now, we've talked about that before here on the program, where the accused is presumed to be guilty based on his status, and the tried and true practices of an adversarial system have been discarded. Then Kyle Rittenhouse wouldn't have stood a chance, and a righteous blow would ostensibly have been struck against white supremacy. He says this is obviously a dangerous tendency that is going to get more pronounced and powerful in the years ahead. The Rittenhouse verdict shows that it hasn't yet perverted our system of justice, but all people of goodwill who believe in fair play and the rule of law will have to resist it with all their might. So I think he's got a good point about the fact that if we continue going down the road that this time we seemingly did not, we end up with a justice system that looks a lot more like maybe a third world country, and that's not what we want for the United States. But let's get to some things other than those in the news, and this is an interesting trend because I have posted as our second article, The Coddling of American Children. Now, it caught my attention for a few reasons. First of all, of course, we've talked about the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. We've had Jonathan Haidt on here. We've quoted it many times before. But here you have an individual who actually comes from China and actually talks about the striking difference between what it's like for his son when he was in school in China compared to the United States. He says, as a Chinese doctoral student raising a young son in the U.S., I am mystified how the American elementary schools coddle students. In China, schools are run like boot camps. Now, I'm not arguing that we actually implement something that looks like boot camps in the elementary grades, but he is making a point because he says if you look back at where his son was, and that's in Chengdu, China, and I've had a number of my colleagues that have been to Chengdu, China, he would trot off to school each day with a backpack stuffed with thick textbooks and materials for practices and quizzes. Here he leaves for school with little in his backpack other than the required healthy snack. He says, it's a core belief, for example, a little bit later in the article, that in Chinese society, talent can be trained, so schools should be tough on children. Chinese students score at the top of the international math and science tests. You've heard me talk about before how low American students study and actually do in those tests. And he says, on Friday night, my son came home announcing in bewilderment that he didn't have any homework. In China, students tend to receive twice as much homework on the weekend, given the 2 days to complete it. How will America compete with China determined to train the best mathematicians, scientists, and engineers? I'm thinking of the book by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat, in which he said, growing up, my parents oftentimes would say, finish your dinner because there are children in India and China who are starving. He says, today I say to my girls, finish your homework because there are students in India and China who want your job. And if we want to compete in an international market, we've got to start thinking about whether or not we've been coddling our children. And of course, you can see the protests that have been taking place in some of the school boards when not only are we not giving them rigorous academic material, but we are focusing on everything from pornographic material that shouldn't be shown in the schools in the first place to critical race theory. Good piece. It's the number two piece there, and I thought you would enjoy talking about and learning about the coddling of American children. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then next hour we're going to have Philip Yancey with us as we talk about his book, Where the Light Fell. And I think you will really appreciate that interview. And, of course, you're welcome to call in, make some comments if you would like to do so. I mentioned China just a minute ago, and I thought I would remind you that the October issue of Outlook, which those of you that support this ministry probably have already received, but if you don't support this ministry and like to get a copy of it, it deals with the issue of China. And there are a number of very important sections in there. I talk about China's global ambitions and take that into some detail. Ivy Nichols talks about countering China's long game. And then you have a whole section by Liberty McCarter on human rights and Hong Kong. And the reason I bring it up is since we were talking about China just a minute ago, you're starting to see other people saying the same thing we've been saying on this program. This comes from U.S. News and World Report. They said the People's Liberation Army, that's China's name for its military, says the U.S. News and World Report, is capable of landing at least 25,000 troops on Taiwan to establish an initial beachhead, according to a newly released annual report from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, a congressionally appointed agency designed to provide specific and nonpartisan national security and economic advice to Congress and the President. Again, U.S. News and World Report goes on to say, further complicating existing U.S. efforts to deter China from seizing control of Taiwan by force are new tactics by the People's Liberation Army that have employed that offset some of the U.S. military's potency in the region. The report documents that the Chinese military is trained with barges, ferries, and other civilian vessels to transport military troops across the Taiwan Straits or elsewhere, in addition to more conventional military transports. Given these deployments, it says, it has become less certain that the U.S. conventional military forces alone will continue to deter China's leaders from initiating an attack on Taiwan. We've talked about this before. My argument has been that I believe China will want to move on Taiwan. They may wait till after the Olympics next year, but this is a source of some concern. And if you'd like to know more about what is happening in China and why we should be so concerned about the country, and again, I always have to issue this disclaimer, just because we're critical of the Chinese Communist Party doesn't mean that we're anti-Asian or we're against Chinese people. Many of these people in China have to suffer under this brutal regime, and of course it's quite possible that some of the people in Taiwan might suffer under their leadership in the future, if indeed what we suspect could happen would be the case. And it brings us back to the fact that, do you believe that if a president were in office like Ronald Reagan, or even, for that matter, Donald Trump, China would be less inclined or more inclined to actually go into Taiwan? Given the current president is Joe Biden, I'll let you come to your own conclusions, but I think we know what that might mean as well. My third and final article, we'll talk about this hour, and then, of course, we'll be with Philip Yancey next hour, comes from our good friend Michael Brown. Dr. Michael Brown's been on the program before, and it's entitled, Get Used to the Heat and Get in the Kitchen. He said, you've heard the saying, if you don't like the heat, then get out of the kitchen. Well, that only works if you're not called to be in the kitchen. For those of us who are called to be there, it would be better to say, get used to the heat and get in the kitchen. And he talks about the fact that, you know, what he does as a talk show host and as an individual that writes for everything from Town Hall to The Stream, writes a number of books that we've talked about on this program. He says, look, on a daily basis, often from many different sides, I get blasted for positions I take in writing or on the air. Should I have a pity party, feel sorry for myself, throw in the towel? He says that's utterly ridiculous. If I'm going to address controversial issues or take controversial stands, the disagreements and counterattacks are sure to come. That's the nature of the game, and that's part of the process of public discourse, however messy it may be. And so he goes on to a little bit later say that my goal is to be a witness to the truth as best as I understand it, to bring an uncompromising and often uncomfortable message in a gracious and compassionate spirit. That being done, I'm happy to let the chips fall where they may. And again, let me just simply say that Michael Brown is certainly known for everything from talking about evangelism to Jewish people, because he's former Jewish, became a Christian, the area of apologetics, but he also takes on all the issues of LGBTQ issues, takes on scandals within the Christian church, and all sorts of other things. And so I'm sure he gets it from all sides. And it's interesting, given his Jewish background, that one of the quotes he uses is from the book of Leviticus. Okay, let's all be honest. In your morning quiet time, you're probably not in the book of Leviticus unless you're one of those individuals, and let me give you high praise for that, who reads through the Bible in 1 year. That sort of forces you into Leviticus, but I thought it was interesting because he says in the book of Leviticus, immediately before love your neighbor as yourself, which we all know, the scripture says, do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so that you will not share their guilt. And so the point he's making is that sometimes we don't look at all the verses in context, because what he's pointing out is that love, he says, often requires confrontation. Since the goal of love is to help the other person, not make us feel comfortable. And love does what is difficult. Love speaks and acts. Love never fails. I would add to that we are, I think, more than ever called to speak truth into a culture of untruth. We're called to, of course, as Christians, speak the truth in love. We can do it in gracious ways. We can be disagreeing without being disagreeable, but there is a real need for some of us to say, if we're going to really have an impact in our culture, I think it's going to be really important for us to actually not let lies actually stay out there, to live not by lies, as we talk about from Rod Dreyer's book, or even the very famous essay by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but we should live by the truth. So at the end he says, so ask God for grace and courage and wisdom, wait for the right moments to speak and act, get used to the heat, and get in the kitchen. It really is time. And to repeat, your presence is needed. So, very good piece. It's the third article we've posted here today, and it's just a reminder that we are calling for you to be a good public witness and to recognize that sometimes people are going to call you names that you may not like. I saw this piece also by our good friend Frank Wright. Dr. Frank Wright is, of course, with the D. James Kennedy Ministry, and he talks about why we are appealing our lawsuit against the Southern Poverty Law Center to the Supreme Court. Because he points out, and we'll probably get into some more of this tomorrow because it relates to some of the other topics we will address, in which we're not really allowed to have free speech. And if I disagree with you, I'll just simply label you as racist. And it's one thing for somebody to call you a racist or a white supremacist, or for them to call you some kind of phobia, whether it's, Islamophobia, homophobia, whatever. But it's quite another for, as the Southern Poverty Law Center has done, to post this hate map. And I like one of his ideas there. He says, you will take legitimate ministries and put them next to groups like the KKK and the Aryan Nation. He says they falsely and outrageously put David Duke next to David Barton, and D. James Kennedy's ministry right next to the American Nazi Party. And so they are asking the Supreme Court to review the lawsuit they've had against the Southern Poverty Law Center for its false and defamatory allegation. I'll get into more of that later in the week, but it's just a reminder that you can't say, I didn't expect that I was going to be criticized, because after all, you might remember Jesus saying, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. So you might as well stand up for truth, because one way or the other, you're going to get labeled. Might as well do it because you were speaking truth with love in a culture that desperately needs it. Let's take a break. When we come back, Philip Yancey with us, and I think you will enjoy his memoir, which is entitled Where the Light Fell. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we have a chance to talk with our good friend Philip Yancey, again, an individual, author of more than 24 books, such things as Jesus I Never Knew, What's So Amazing About Grace, The Gift of Pain, Soul Survivor, How 13 Unlikely Mentors Helped My Faith Survive the Church, as well as the book we're going to focus on now, Where the Light Fell, a memoir. He says, I truly believe this one book that I was put on earth to write, so many strands of my childhood, racial hostility, political division, culture wars have resurfaced in modern form. Looking back points me forward. The book came out last month. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But we also wanted to spend some time with him. He is, of course, just a very gifted writer, has been able to receive at least 13 Gold Medallion Book Awards, currently more than 17 million copies of his book in print. And so, again, it is always a pleasure to have you on the program, Philip Yancey.
Thank you very much, Kerby.
This is an interesting book because it is your memoir, it is your background, but you open with a shock, and that is you, growing up, heard of the tragic story of your father, who you saw as a spiritual giant dying of polio. When I talk to younger people, they don't even know about that. I have actually one person on my staff that has polio and two others that had it in the past that had been on staff. But nevertheless, that was something that you just sort of assumed was true. And then one day, as you talk about early on in the book, you found out there was a lot more to the story, and it shook you to your core, I would say.
You're absolutely right. Of course, I knew that he had died. I grew up raised by a widow. She never remarried, and felt that fatherlessness that boys feel as they grow up and have no one to play catch with or teach them how to fish and things like that. I was 18 when I just stumbled across a clipping from the Atlanta Constitution newspaper that explained some of the backstory to his death. The newspaper clipping was written when he had just been removed from an iron lung. He had been in an iron lung, machine that breathed for him.
Yes. Just
pressed the air in and out of his lungs for 2 months. And it was in a charity hospital. He wasn't getting very good care. He was miserable. They were planning to be missionaries, my mother and father. They were going to Africa, had as many as 5,000 people on a list who agreed to pray for them and support them. And some of those people became convinced that he would be healed. Why would God possibly take, in air quotes, a person who was so committed and had such great potential as a missionary? Why would God let him die? And so they came to believe that he would be healed. They prayed for the healing, and, they had his best interest at heart for sure. But turns out they took a leap that they really didn't have the right to take. They were so strongly convinced that he would be healed that they removed him from the iron lung, took him out of that hospital, and sent him to a little clinic which was not equipped to deal with a polio patient. And the article that I read, brand new to me, I'd never heard the story. The article was written when he was showing some mild improvement, and they thought, well, maybe healing is on the way. But I looked at the date, and it was 9 days before he died. And things clicked into place. I understood now some of my mother's flashback from going through that, her sincerity, her vow that we, her sons, would replace him as a missionary, and how that worked out in our lives, which was not a pretty thing, especially in my brother's life. So that was a shock that I learned only 18 years after the fact.
As you put it, quite by accident, I am discovering that this man whom I never knew, a saintly giant looming over me all these years, was sort of a holy fool. He convinced himself that God would heal him, then gambled everything, his career, his wife, his 2 sons, and lost. And you talk about it's kind of like Noah's sons confronting Noah and a number of other things. And if you will allow the metaphor, once that first domino drops, really, as you read through the rest of your book, you begin to realize how each one of those dominoes hits another domino and creates a set of circumstances you found yourself in.
You're right. And I later learned that that's not that unusual. I've read books by Orthodox Jewish people who grow up and their parents want them to be a rabbi, and when they don't become a rabbi, they become an artist or a lawyer or something instead. They're disowned. And that's how I felt, because my mother committed us in a vow to replace her husband who had died.
Yes.
And when it turned out that we weren't kind of towing the same line that she thought we should be towing, she basically lost it. And at one point cursed my brother for doing the abominable sin of going to Wheaton College, of all things. She thought that was completely out of line. She didn't approve of that school. It wasn't conservative enough. And they have not seen each other in 51 years since then.
It's just amazing. And again, let's, if we can, before we take a break here, just maybe have you talk a little bit more about this idea of growing up in a very strict, legalistic kind of home, because anybody that's read, for example, What's So Amazing About Grace recognizes that that is something that you had to address, and that's maybe why you were so eloquent in that best-selling book.
Things were different when I was growing up. I was coming of age in the 1950s and 60s. Nowadays, politics is so much a part of religion and churches. It really wasn't back then. We considered ourselves kind of separate from all that. We wanted to be different from the world around us, come out from them and be separate, the Bible says. So we showed our separateness by things we didn't do. We didn't roller skate, look too much like dancing. We didn't bowl. They might serve alcohol in the bowling alleys. Of course, we didn't smoke, drink, any of those kind of things. And we were different. We were unique. We were certainly unlike the kids around us in school, but it wasn't defined by ideas and politics so much. It was defined by legalistic behavior. And in a sense, we felt superior because we didn't do those things. And, of course, that's not that different than the Pharisees in Jesus' day, who are also very strict and kept all the laws of the Old Testament. But it's easy when you do that to start looking down on other people and to miss some of the basic issues going on around you. Like in my case, growing up in the South, racism. Nobody talked about racism as a negative thing, and that became a crisis of faith for me later.
Well, of course. And we need to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about, of course, what it's like living in an 8-foot wide trailer and some of that, and get into some of those other aspects, because we do later on find, as you've written about in other books, and I'm thinking about, for example, The Soul Survivor and some of the others, about these were really big challenges. And you and I come from an entirely different kind of background. I grew up in a very liberal kind of perspective around individuals that weren't necessarily Christians. So when I became a Christian, it was kind of going one direction, but you were coming from the other direction. Maybe we're going to meet somewhere in the middle. I don't know. We'll find that out. But it is, I think, a striking illustration as you get to know you, because so many of our listeners have read one of your books, to understand some of the background on that. And so we're going to talk about some of these very important issues, including living in the South and even the issue of race and racial prejudice and much more. There's just so much that we will try to unpack. We'll do our best. But perhaps if it strikes a chord, and you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Harvard professor Steven Pinker has a simple explanation for why Republicans wanted to reopen the economy. Evangelicals were exerting an influence because they believe in an afterlife, which he said is a malignant delusion. It was a bizarre tweet, even for an atheist. Although many have answered his comment, I thought we might revisit it because you are likely to run into similar arguments. Pinker argued that belief in an afterlife devalues actual lives and discourages action that would make them longer, safer, and happier. Actually, just the opposite is the case. Evangelical Christians believe that we are created in the image of God. He has endowed us with purpose, meaning, and dignity. Christians have historically been a source for good. They believe that what we do in society has eternal consequences. By contrast, an atheistic view devalues life. If we're merely an evolutionary byproduct, where is human dignity? If we're the accidental result of mass plus energy plus chance plus time, where is there any meaning to life? Moreover, why should we even care what another person might think, since our brain is just a meat computer with millions of neurons firing? There is no truth. There is no purpose. The Bible makes moral demands on us. Western civilization is based upon the Ten Commandments and other moral precepts. Civilized people obey these moral laws in order to have a better society. Atheism makes no demands on anyone because it rejects the idea of God and moral laws. I would argue that the denial of an afterlife is a malignant delusion. If there is no final justice, then wrongs will never be accurately judged. There is no God. There is no justice. There is no fairness. This is the sad, dark world of the atheist. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Philip Yancey. The book is entitled Where the Light Fell, a Memoir, and it is published by Convergent, and we have information about it on the website. It is in hardback, but also in Kindle. You can probably find it in your local bookstore, but we give you all sorts of other ways in which you could order it, as well as information about Philip Yancey. Philip, if we can, maybe I'll focus some time on your boyhood, and I was just thinking that you could really summarize a lot of that with two words: fear and church. In the chapter on awakenings, you said, my earliest memories all involve fear. Can you explain that?
Yes, I go ahead and spell out those memories, and as I look at them now, they're really about growing up in what we would call a slum today. It didn't feel like it at the time. It was just my home. Mm-hmm. It was a government housing project that built for veterans. My father had served in the Navy right at the end of World War II, was on the way to join the Pacific Theater when the war ended. And it was a scary place. There was fighting and alcohol and pounding on the door and sirens at night, mm-hmm. and warnings about kids who are doing all sorts of bad things to other kids, and we just grew up in a fearful place, much like many people in inner city neighborhoods do today.
And so, again, it was just full of turmoil, not exactly helpful. I mean, here you start thinking about strikes against you. First of all, you have an absent father. You have a very legalistic mother. We'll get into more of that in just a minute. You're in a very dysfunctional kind of relationship and dysfunctional geographical location. It is amazing, as you probably have remarked more than once, that you and Marshall turned out as well as you did in light of that. But in the midst of that, let me get to that other word, fear and church, because as you talk about in one of the chapters, church defines my life. And all of our listeners out there know that when the church doors were open, you were expected to be there, and especially for your mother and things like vacation, Bible school, and the rest, everybody knew where Philip Yancey was going to be at that time, didn't they?
That's right. She would usually head up the Christian education program up at church. She also taught Bible clubs with an organization called Bible Club Movement. So when we were kids, we would trail along with her as 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and hear the same Bible story every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So we got a good Bible grounding. And then in high school years, we actually lived in this trailer on church property. We could never get away from the church. Whenever it was open, we had to be there. You know, Kerby, one reason I wrote this book is there are a lot of people who have had kind of stained or wounds from the church, and they just kind of dismiss it and run away. I hear there are as many as 25, 30 million ex-evangelicals raised in that environment but left. And one of the things I learned is it is a bad trade if you decide, because of the way I was treated in some church or something I didn't like about a church, I'm just going to stop trying to relate to God. That is a bad trade, to forfeit the chance to relate to the God who created the universe because of the way you were treated. And I want to give hope that there can be redemptive stories even to these wounds from family and church, because a lot of people have experienced them.
Hey, you know, one of the things that I have noticed at Pro Ministries, where I spend part of my day, is that when we each year kind of total up which of the articles we've posted, and these would be transcripts from radio programs and other articles, one that is almost always in the top 10 is one on spiritual abuse or abusive churches. Sometimes we now have a couple that are in that same category, because you know that there are people that have either in the past or even currently are dealing with some kind of abusive aspect of the church. And it could be everything from sexual abuse, which we've talked about so often here on this program, with people like Mary DeMuth and a variety of others, and June Hunt, or it could just be simply just this authoritarian, abusive kind of mindset. And when I used to speak on college campuses, I don't do that as much now because I'm doing the show every day, I would sometimes run into people that were very hostile to religion, and I would always assume that they grew up in an atheistic home. And 2 out of every 3 times, maybe even 3 out of every 4 times, I found out, no, they grew up in a very legalistic church home. And so your writings and your own experience maybe have been helpful to people recognizing that the gospel is a gospel of grace, but sometimes there's not a lot of grace found within the walls of a church.
Absolutely right. And when I look back on it, the worst thing that the church did was misrepresent God. I remember speaking to, I think it was the University College chaplain, maybe even at Harvard or a place like that. And he said again and again, kids would come in, sit in a chair and say, I don't believe in God. And he would say, tell me what kind of God you don't believe in. I probably don't believe in him either. and the image of God that I had growing up in that church was, this cosmic rule keeper up in the sky who was just waiting to smash somebody who might be straying a little bit. I totally miss that idea of God as the longing father in the prodigal son story. At the edge of his porch every day, scanning the horizon, could today be the day that my lost son comes back? That's the image of God that Jesus showed, and it took me a long time to discover that, away from that rule-keeping, smashing God that I came away from childhood with.
You know, again, I mentioned a couple of words that maybe describe your childhood, and of course, one of those is fear, the other one is church. Maybe just one more, poor, and that is in your chapter on trailer trash, you said, it finally hit me that I was poor, and yet you learned from some of the other trailer kids how to have some fun, and you were able to sort of, in some ways, redeem the time in a way that maybe isn't biblical, but nevertheless gave you just a little bit of hope and helped you just get through the day.
We did. My mother made sure that we weren't part of the whole impoverished culture. I was a great reader. My brother was a great musician. He just had natural talent. And so I'm sitting there in this little trailer in the middle of a trailer park where kids are squirting each other with water pistols outside, and my brother's playing the piano and I'm reading books, you know. And that was an important window. It kind of preserved us and made us think the people in this trailer park and the issues that we deal with here are not all there is. There's another world out there, and I want to join that world and explore it someday.
Well, very good. Can we now maybe move on to which is one of your sections on the roots, and that is gets into the South. Now, again, Philip, we broadcast all over the country, and so we have people in places like Alaska or Maine or New Hampshire or Oregon that maybe can't relate to what it would be like to live in the South, whether we're talking about Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, whatever. But I thought it was kind of interesting the way you open that section. 1961. You're in the 7th grade. The National Book Award goes to Walker Piercy, a novelist from Mississippi. But let's, if we can, remind people, although we're being reminded more and more every day, what it was like in the South when you were growing up.
We didn't talk about the Civil War, Kirby. We talked about the War of Northern Aggression.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Atlanta had been burned to the ground. General Sherman just destroyed the city, and everywhere you go in Atlanta, even to this day, you're going to find some metal signposts that tell you about this battle was fought here, and this general led it, and how many people died. The Civil War was right in our face. You couldn't get away from it. Of course, right outside of Atlanta, there's this stone mountain with this huge, massive carving of 3 Confederate generals. The high school I went to was named for one of those generals, General John Gordon. So the Civil War was in your face. We were aware of it every day. And Walker Percy said, so much of what great writing comes from the South has to do with the fact that we lost the war. If you lose it, you don't forget. If you win it, you do forget. People, I think, in Philadelphia and New York don't think about the Civil War that much. If you grow up in the South, you think about it a lot.
And again, as you point out, I'd kind of never thought about it before, that back in the 1860s, Atlanta wasn't even the capital of the state. We have lots of listeners that are in Georgia. The estimates were maybe only had about 10,000 residents, but of course, torched the city, reduced stately homes to charred chimneys and all the rest. And so you found yourself in that culture, which was, of course, very different than perhaps what people in other parts of the country were facing. But how did that necessarily affect you and your brother?
Well, we grew up with the myth of the noble cause. These generals, like Robert E. Lee, had the very best record, fewest demerits of anybody who ever went to West Point, whereas his opponent, Ulysses S. Grant, had the most demerits of anybody who ever went to West Point. And we were taught, these were Southern gentlemen. Stonewall Jackson would have devotions every day, and he'd never fight on Sunday unless he was attacked. And those Northerners, they were drunkards, people like Grant and Sherman. They drank a lot, and we were the pure people. What we didn't calculate is that, of course, it was the entire pyramid was being upheld by slavery.
Sure.
And we're still coming to terms with that 150 years later now.
Yeah, well, we will come back and talk a little bit about that, but we have one of those mandatory breaks, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation talking about where the light fell right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue conversation today with Philip Yancey as we talk about his memoir, Where the Light Fell. And Philip, just before we took a break, we were talking about, of course, the Civil War. You consumed some of these books on the Civil War. You convinced your mother every once in a while to take you to some of these Civil War battlefields. And then you even find out from your grandfather there was an ancestor, which has the same last name, known as one of the fire eaters who called the South to secede and helped start the Civil War. And all of this was attractive, but then in the midst of that, you eventually then have the civil rights movement. And help us through that, because that was one of those great kind of, if you will, mental and emotional challenges for you, wasn't it?
It was. And unfortunately, the church we were attending did not really help. They were on the wrong side. They spoke disparagingly of Martin Luther King. And one church we attended actually printed up cards to give to any African Americans who tried to enter, saying, "You're not welcome here. We know you're a troublemaker. You're not a child of God. Keep away," basically. And I grew up in that environment. In fact, they taught this curse of Ham theory, which is some cockamamie theory based on Genesis 9, that the dark races, people of color, were cursed by God and could only be servants. They'd never be masters. They would never be CEOs of company or presidents. And that became a crisis of faith for me, because when I was a sophomore in high school, I won a fellowship at the CDC, then called the Communicable Disease Center. I went in, I knew that I was going to be reporting to this renowned biochemist. His name was Dr. Cherry. He was from an Ivy League school. He had specialized in the staining techniques of bacteria, stuff that was way above my head. I tried to understand some of his writings before I met him, just to not look too stupid. And then I walked into his office, and it was a black man. And bells went off, Kerby. I realized the church lied to me. They said a person of color could never rise to this kind of level of science, and yet here he was. And he became a mentor. He was a kind and gentle man who worked with me throughout the summer. And it became a crisis of faith, because I thought, well, if the church lied about race, maybe they lied about Jesus. Maybe they lied about the Bible.
Of course.
And I started picking that apart, and just kind of, my faith went into a kind of suspension for about 4 years. And that's why churches really need to be very careful what they teach, because they may think it's innocent, but if you get one thing wrong, you can turn a person away from God for the rest of their lives. And I was in danger of having that happen, because the church was wrong about race. And it took me quite some time to overcome that, and then, of course, to go back and change all of my opinions about everything to do with race. And here we are, 50 years later, going over some of that same ground that I thought was settled back during the days of the civil rights movement.
Isn't that amazing? And again, we've talked on this program before about people that have deconstructed their faith. A lot of them have been very prominent individuals, musicians, in some cases pastors, but individuals that maybe weren't grounded in biblical ideas, but grounded in some kind of churchiana ideas. And as soon as the church fails, there's a scandal, there's a question, there's a philosophical answer that people don't know, that or question that they don't know there's an answer for. That always seems to cause people to give up. And it is, I think, striking that here in your particular situation, you just had to say, I'm going to put my faith on hold here for a while, because I don't know what to do with all this. But again, as you said, if the church lied about this, what else did they lie about? And it can really shake your faith. Well, let's keep moving, because I want to get you in high school and college, obviously. And you went through some things. Of course, your mother moved to Kentucky, and you moved as well. So kind of take us through that, because then once you had to head off to college, and I don't want to get too far ahead, you could have gone to a different school, but given the fact that Marshall went to this one, you probably had to go to the same one as well. So kind of take us through that issue as well, because it just, again, shows a lot about the family dynamic.
Yes, through a lot of parental pressure. Again, we had been given the script of what our lives should look like. And my brother went to a Bible college in a nearby state. I don't use the name of the Bible college because it's a lot different place now than when we went there. And then I followed him. And for the first few weeks, I thought, well, I can be one of these Bible college students. You just need to go through the motions. You need to give testimonies. You need to pray out loud. I knew how to do those things. And then I realized it wasn't real anymore. It was just a performance. And I happily became a renegade. I would do things, Kerby, like sit in the middle of the patio reading Why I Am Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell and things like that. And really had given up on my faith. This was a real conservative place, and some of the teachers weren't helpful. They were teaching things that I just didn't buy. And I although I was surrounded by the Bible college environment, I just wasn't into it. And God met me. It was a surprise, but God met me in that place in a dramatic conversion story, which I wasn't really seeking and didn't really want at the time. But it was so true that it just changed everything. My brother and I took very different paths from then on. He became one of the original hippies in Atlanta, eventually moved to California, experimented with every kind of behavior you can. And watching him, I saw how self-destructive that was, and I went a different course. I was blessed to find people who truly were the kind of people I wanted to be like. They became my mentors. So even as a young writer, after graduating from college, I started doing journalism, and I gravitated toward those people that I wanted to learn from. A lot of journalists back then, and I was tempted, were looking for the Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein kind of investigative reporting, and I tried that, and I didn't like it because you're around jerks a lot. I wanted to be around people who could show me how to live, and I stumbled across this Dr. Paul Brand, who became a great mentor
Yes.
and a father figure for me for many years, and tried to focus the rest of my career shining the light on people who are often overlooked. They're not in the spotlight, but are in their humble way out there doing the work of God and perpetuating the kingdom all over the world. I've seen that as a journalist, and I love to find those people and shine that light on them.
And one of the things I mentioned earlier, the gift of pain, you wrote that with Dr. Paul Brand, and I probably learned more about individuals that have felt no pain and individuals that actually were, if you will, devoid of pain, and how that is really a gift. And so when people hear the gift of pain, you kind of wince at it a little bit. But of course, Dr. Brand, a surgeon and an individual that had worked with individuals that, of course, felt no pain, could help us understand that. But again, that was in some respects the therapy that of some of the struggles that you were dealing with, and the need for a father figure and a need for a mentor, that was actually fulfilled in that particular way. And of course, we were the blessed individuals that had a chance to read those books and benefit from some of your own inquiry as you had a chance to work with people like Dr. Paul Brand.
We were an odd couple. I was in my 20s. He was in his 60s. He's a British surgeon, just very different, but we got along. And he died in 2003. And I remember at his funeral, Kerby saying, we had a different exchange, Dr. Brand and I. I gave words to his faith because he'd never written them down before, and I would draw from him all of his concepts, his ideas, and put them into book form. But while I was giving words to his faith, he was giving faith to my words. Because it really only takes one person who is a genuine Jesus follower who shows you this is what God meant with the human race. This is what God meant us to be, to convince you there's something there. There's something, a pearl of great price that's worth it, more than anything you can imagine. And he became that symbol for me.
Again, who would have guessed an individual that had worked with leprosy patients would actually be a co-author of a book that perhaps answers some of those very vexing questions about pain that everybody from C.S. Lewis all the way down have actually written about. And so we need to take a break, but I might also mention as we're going to the break that we do have a link to philipyancey.com. Don't have to remember how to spell all that because it's on the website. One of the more recent blog posts is What Makes a Church church toxic? And of course, that's part of the theme of what we've been talking about, some of the difficulties in those early years that certainly were ones that Philip Yancey had to work through. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about some of the other aspects of that early life, and this is part of the memoir, which is entitled Where the Light Fell. Philip Yancey with us today, and I think you'll really appreciate the book and find a lot of points of connection as well. It's published by Convergent. We have information about it on the website, and I think you will certainly appreciate by clicking on that button to go to Philip Yancey, but we also have a link to hardcover and Kindle in case you would like to read it and have access to it, and I think it would be very helpful, especially if you know individuals that have been struggling with their faith. Maybe they've had a bad experience in the church. This might help them understand that you can find light on the other side, even sometimes when you're in a very dark tunnel. Well, let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover with Philip Yancey right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, talking about the book, the memoir, Where the Light Fell by Philip Yancey, and be a good time to tie up some loose ends, except you can't tie up some of the loose ends because that brings us, Philip, to the curse. A lot of people might say, okay, you mentioned Marshall, kind of became a hippie, travels across the nation. Your mother, of course, in a condominium that you got for, and trying to bring a son and a mother together together, and you found yourself in the middle and not really able to ever make that happen, did you?
That's true. When I turned in the book manuscript, amazingly, Kerby, in the last few months even, there has been a lot of movement. I've gotten my mother and brother on a three-way phone conversation. The first time either has heard the other's voice in 51 years.
Amazing.
And astonishingly, after all that's happened, my brother wrote a 3-word card to my mother. He's disabled. It's not easy for him to do that. He can only use his left hand. But the card had 3 words, I forgive you, which I never would have predicted. But the story's not over. It's a story of grace, and oh, ye of little faith. I guess I had not enough faith in my own family, and maybe the memoir contributed a little bit to some of that softening for my brother. His story finally got told. He felt he was represented well, and I guess felt finally strong enough to even think about forgiving.
That's amazing. Again, that's part of the chapter on the curse. And of course, we're going to give you the rest of that story as well. But you have the difficulty. I've had that a little bit with a few books that I wrote before my mother died. But you talk about one place where your mother's anger boils over just simply when you publish the book Soul Survivor, because, of course, people start asking you some questions, as you might imagine that they might do, about your racist past, Southern fundamentalism, and the rest. And that did not go well, did it?
Did not go well. Evidently, you know what that's like. And in the phone call, my mother's first words were, "Maybe I should have had that abortion after all."
Yeah.
That's a pretty low blow.
I'd say so.
And but we have made a lot of peace. And she's living. She's 97. She knows I've been writing a memoir. It was quite helpful to me. I would interview her, and she'd fill in some gaps in facts that I wasn't quite sure of. And we have a good relationship, actually.
Well, again, you go take us through the entire story, but I thought maybe you could share some of the lessons or that you would like people maybe to learn vicariously from your own experience. And one, of course, obviously talked about that whole issue of the racist past and Civil War and a noble cause and the rest. But I think there are some other themes that run through it, but rather than bring them up, I'd like to hear you mention what you thought those were.
Yeah, one of them I would say is that not everybody who claims to speak for God is actually doing so. And we've mentioned a few examples. The people who thought my father would be healed and acted on that, they were sure they were doing God's will, and they were wrong, and he died. And the people who had the racist theology, they were sure that they were correct, but they were wrong. And a lot of people suffered because of that. So we need to be careful. We need to be discerning. And the church, in its various kind of self-correct things, needs to really look at, make sure they're speaking truth when they speak for God. My own life, I really, at the end of the book, when I put everything together, I realized there were 2 themes that kept coming back in almost all my writing. The theme of suffering, the theme of grace. The theme of suffering, I kind of was born in pain, and when I was just a year old, my father died. That defined the fact that we were going to live in poverty. My mother was going to be this harassed woman who has a very hard time just paying the bills, keeping the home going. And so I was aware of pain, and I went through some painful times as a teenager. And that made me sensitive to those who are suffering. And a lot of my time, I've been going to places like Columbine High School, Virginia Tech, Newtown, Japan after the tsunami, asked to speak on suffering and pain because I know it firsthand, and I've learned some principles about it that I can share and try to bring some comfort. And the other theme is grace. Yes. And I just cherish this, that all of your listeners would really understand grace. And I grew up in an environment that I call ungrace. And when you take that first gulp of grace, really realizing what God is like, that God is not that angry bully in the sky. God is like the Father waiting for the Son to come home. When you realize that, then you realize I've missed the whole gospel. And it is good news. That's what the word evangelical means. It's a good news gospel. And we in the church need to get back to communicating to a thirsty world there's really only one answer for your thirst, and that's the living water that Jesus offers.
Well said. We do have a link to your website, which is philipyancey.com. The post that I point people to is What Makes a Church Toxic? And you talk about fear. Of course, we've already covered that. Exclusion, and I think we've implied that in rigidity. And then, of course, you go back and look at what makes a healthy church. Oftentimes, when I do have a chance to speak on abusive churches or toxic faith or whatever, I say, look at all these negatives. Now, just take the antonym of each one of those, and that gives you an understanding of what a healthy church or a healthy Christian life looks like. And so I do want to point people to that blog, which in some respects is a good way to get into your book, but we certainly have valued the writing that you have done over the years. And as people find their way to the website, there's, of course, the blog, but your other books and other resources. And even if somebody would have you come and speak, I believe there's a way they can contact you there as well, isn't there?
That's true. Yeah, it's true. And I thank you for your care in doing the research and looking at my other writings and pulling all that together, Kerby. You've done a wonderful job, and I really thank you for that.
Well, thank you for your writing, and we've all been a great beneficiary of your writing over the years, and it is always great to have you here on Point of View. So thank you for joining us today.
It was my pleasure. I appreciate it.
Let me just give you kind of an overview of what we're going to cover over the next couple of days. Seems to me that it is most appropriate that we need to start talking about, okay, how do we answer some of these questions that people have? And one of the things we'll talk about tomorrow is why I trust the Bible. And then we'll also be talking with Mark Yarborough, tidings of comfort and joy. I know we're getting close not only to Thanksgiving, but Christmas, so that seemed appropriate. Jerry Newcomb will be with us on Wednesday, and we're going to talk about the pilgrims and Thanksgiving, and this, of course, is Thanksgiving week. So you find some great resources that we will be trying to provide every single day, and I certainly want to encourage you that if this would be a book that you would like to get a copy of, or if you know somebody that has been hurt by a church or church discipline or toxic faith of some sort, this might be the book for them. But maybe the simpler way to go about that is to go to our website, which is pointofview.net. We have a place where you can click on that red button that says listen. You could send them the podcast, and maybe they would enjoy the interview that might then cause them to go and get a copy of the book. Click on the button that says watch. Of course, you can also go to the YouTube channel. You'll find it there as well. I also have today a Viewpoints commentary, which is really based upon a piece that came out from Harvard professor Steven Pinker, in which he says even the idea of believing in an afterlife is a malignant delusion. Maybe that helps you understand some of the harshness of our atheist friends and the reason why we want to help you be more equipped to answer their questions and really share the gospel with them. So you're going to find lots of great material on our website, which is pointofview.net. And as you go there, if you would consider clicking on that blue button, there's an opportunity for you to support this ministry. And if you've appreciated the conversation we've had today, we would certainly value your financial support. And certainly as we come to year end, we certainly do encourage you to consider what you might do. I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer. I want to thank Steve for his help as a producer. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.